Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Turkey and Russia have come to an agreement of sorts to normalize the situation in Syria's Idlib. Now, obviously, when we're talking about Turkey-Russia relations in general, there have been moments where it has cooled and moments where they seem to be getting closer. It seems now that the trajectory, at least, is that these two nations are getting that much closer, especially with the recent trip that Erdogan made there to Russia and specifically to that air show as well. What does this mean, though, going forward, specifically in the context of Syria as well, where these two countries disagree on so much? So even when they've spoken about normalizing the situation in Syria's Idlib, Russia has spoken about terrorism. Turkey has spoken about Syria's government needing to stop its bombardment of the area. Who will win out? How will all of this work, or will this work at all? We know that, of course, there is a meeting coming up between the three countries, the main three guarantors of the Astana process, at the very least, i.e. Turkey, Russia, and Iran. That meeting coming up quite soon. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who is a political analyst. He's also affiliated with Kingston University, and he's the author of The Privatization of Warfare. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined by Tim Kirby, who is a political analyst for strategic culture, and he's joining us now from the Russian capital, Moscow. Tim and Nicolai, thank you both for your time today. Tim, I'd like to start with you. What is the Russian game plan here at this point? Do you think that it will win out, quote unquote, when it comes to the issue of Idlib and otherwise, considering, of course, as you well know, Turkey seemingly has polar opposite interests in that region?
Well, that's exactly, you're exactly right about the polar opposite interests. If we look at the recent news about Turkey establishing a buffer zone, moving its troops onto the territory of Syria, and in fact, just a couple of days ago, a Turkish military convoy was hit by the Syrians on Syrian territory around Idlib. So you could see that there's a desire by the Turks to expand south because they don't really have any other options in terms of expansion. Obviously, Syria represents for Moscow one of its last foreign locales where it can actually show that it has international influence. We can't forget that after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia really lost pretty much everything except maybe some access to Syria. And recently, I believe a base in Vietnam a few years ago came back into Russian possession. So essentially, the real conflict here is that Turkey wants to expand. Russia wants to be able to have influence in independent Syria, and that's where the standoff is. So it's kind of hard to imagine that they can really reach a true agreement when they have completely opposite goals.
Okay, so Nicolai, if I may bring in the U into all of this as well, because that's a huge factor, I imagine, in Turkey leaning more towards Russia, isn't it? And especially, of course, we can talk about the S-400, the F-35, et cetera, and of course, the huge factor of Turkey also being a NATO member. What are your thoughts on that?
I think my colleague hit the nail on the head there. I would also add that if there's going to be a relationship between Russia and Turkey, from the Turkish perspective, yes, turning to Russia as a way of putting pressure on the U.S. is one way of looking at it. But at the same time, this is a very unequal partnership. Right now, Putin has several energy deals lined up in Syria with the Assad regime. Turkey has gone from wanting influence in Syria to saying, we have refugees coming into Turkey, we need to deal with them, they're no longer welcome. So the game has changed for Turkey a little bit. And I think we can see this quite symbolically when Erdogan was welcomed to the air show in Moscow to talk about military options and whatnot. And Putin bought him an ice cream. Now, I mention this simply because in that moment, we see Erdogan actually saying to Putin, are you going to pay for my ice cream as well? And this is very symbolic of how Putin is treating his so-called ally. Putin wants to show that he is a man who holds all the cards in Syria and that he's really deeply expanding into the Middle East in a way that perhaps Turkey no longer is able to do. I think my colleague is quite right when he says that there are limited options for Turkey now. Russia is far deeper into Syria and supports the Assad regime in a way that has allowed Assad to survive. They're also engaging in hybrid warfare through private military companies. So I would say that right now for Moscow, they are using Syria as an extension of foreign policy to keep their bases in the Middle East and as a geostrategic location in a way that Turkey may not be able to do.
Okay, so when it comes to the U.S. issue, do you think that that Turkey is using Russia almost as a pawn when it comes to the concerns that the U.S. has about Turkey vis-a-vis the S-400 and otherwise, or do you think that Turkey is actually genuinely now policy-wise more within the Russian sphere, so to speak of?
mimics a lot of the logic that we hear on Russian TV. They always ask, whose side is Trump on? Whose side are the Turks on? The Turks are on the Turkish side. And if they need to get closer to Moscow in order to maybe intimidate or rattle things in NATO and get the weapons they want at the price they want, they will. If they need to go with the U.S. to work to develop that buffer zone more towards the eastern part of Syria, and where the Kurds are, then they will. The thing is that there's a sort of assumption that Turkey doesn't see itself as an influential power or as some sort of second or third-rate country with no real goals or objectives, and it's not. Erdogan wants to make Turkey great again. God bless him for it. But obviously, a lot of these desires are going to come into conflict with U.S. and Russian interests, and he's got a long road ahead of him in order to restore Turkish greatness. That's for sure.
But then in the middle of all of this, obviously, Tim, are the Syrian people. And as we know, the mess in Syria has been continuing for so many years. Do you think that at the very least, Syria can be a starting point in proving the strengthening of this relationship between Russia and Turkey? Will Russia, for example, be able to convince Turkey to actually speak to Assad directly?
I don't know. I'm not a real big believer in the whole human element of things. I mean, obviously, we're people, we have value in that. But to say that there's going to be some sort of, because there's a humanitarian crisis, that's going to change anything. Wasn't it Madeleine Albright who said when the first time the United States went into Iraq that it was perfectly justified to kill 500,000 Iraqi babies because they needed to take democracy? When you're dealing with politics, the politicians tend to view humans as numbers and statistics, and the whole human face argument, we have to come together because there's refugees, that really doesn't matter. And when you're looking at the world from the throne of people at the very top, things look very different from our human perspective from the bottom. So I don't think that will matter whatsoever. It only matters for generating propaganda to get some sort of California liberals to go out and do street protests. Other than that, it really doesn't have an effect on things. That's brutal to say, but I'm sorry, that's the reality of the situation.
Indeed. No, and I take your point there. But Nicolai, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, especially in the context now where seemingly, at least on the ground in Turkey, the sentiments towards Syrian refugees is shifting. So, I mean, I imagine that adds political pressure on Erdogan to try to help resolve the situation in Syria a bit further. Does that then mean that he would have to swallow a bitter pill and meet Assad, for example?
Well, I think, unfortunately, my colleague is quite correct. For both Putin and Erdogan, what matters the most is power as opposed to people. But of course, you're right that there is going to be pressure because of the refugees, which we haven't seen before. So now, as I mentioned, this is why we see a shift in Turkey's attitude towards Syria, because now it's about getting rid of the refugees. Again, there's going to be an unequal partnership here between Turkey and Russia. Russia does not have a Syrian refugee problem. Turkey does. And so Erdogan might need to swallow this pill to be able to push that forward. I think also I would mention a couple of things. Turkey does look after itself, or Erdogan wants to look after Turkey and make it great again. My colleague is quite right. When the F-35 fighter jet was on the table, Turkey was meant to produce parts for it before the U.S. cut them out of the system due to the S-400 purchase. And then, of course, they turned around and said, we want to produce S-400 parts. So let's not forget that aspect. So Turkey does not want to be a Russian pawn. It does not want to be led by the hand. But we might see that, unfortunately, Putin is the dominant individual in this relationship either way.
Okay, so then do you think, Nicolai, that Turkey has an important role to play when it comes to peace in Syria? Because, again, that remains the question, doesn't it? That the Astana process, and I'm going to include Iran for a moment in this as well, along with Russia, of course. Do you think that Turkey is playing a vital role in that? Because many people would say that Turkey is obviously the only one that represents seemingly the quote-unquote rebel side or militant side or whatever you want to name them. Or do you think it's giving up too much in this process?
Well, I think there are several things. For a start, of course, the U.S. is not involved in such a process, which is symbolically significant. Turkey still remains a NATO ally, so their involvement in this process is of importance. But I think at the same time, they're going to be forced to face pragmatics. The Astana process has seen several ceasefires broken, I believe, at times when Assad has wanted to hit back at Idlib. So remember, Idlib itself is a part of northern Syria that remains symbolic because it remains a stronghold of anti-Assad sentiment. So if the Russians or the pro-Assad forces are able to capture or do damage to Idlib, that's a symbolic victory. Right now, I also think for Turkey, the more refugees they take in, the more pressure Erdogan is under. So he's going to be participating in the Astana process, but he may not necessarily be leading the Astana process.
Okay, so Tim, I wanted to give you the final word just before both of you go. I wanted to ask Tim about your thoughts about Idlib and how things would be resolved there, and as well as peace in Syria in general. I know that's a very macro question to ask, especially considering the complications on the ground there. But what do you make of Turkey's role in all of that, considering, again, as we know from day one, it has been, if I may use this term, anti-Assad?
Well, the end game, that's a really rough one because it could go a lot of different ways. What I think is that Assad is not a dumb man, and apparently the Syrian Arab army is getting better and better at fighting every day. If I were in his position, I would quietly, actually continuously hit Turkish military targets. Why? Because I don't think that Turkey is going to blink and start World War III over this. Because if Turkey then just invades Syria outright, they hit Russian targets, things escalate, and we get this sort of end of the world situation. And I don't think that they're going to do that. I don't quite think that they really have the deep desire to fight this one out. So with this whole supposed accidental or more or less accidental bombing of the Turkish convoy that was on Syrian territory, if I was in Assad's position, I would maybe repeat this. Of course, that's a cutthroat, more Machiavellian way to achieve peace. But I think for the Syrians, that's really the only way because, like I said, Turkey wants to expand. It is not going to be able to expand into Europe. It is not going to be able to go north into Russia. Where else can it go to grow itself and develop? That is mostly south, especially where there's oil, which can fund the expansion. So, unfortunately, Syria's got to deal with the Turks because Russia is, thankfully for them, an ally which is far away and not going to be able to absorb them.
Indeed. Okay, we'll leave there as a final word. But of course, Tim and Nicolai, we appreciate your insight and for sharing your thoughts with us on this topic. Viewers, do stay with us, though. Of course, we will continue discussing this topic after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still discussing Turkey and Russia agreeing to normalize the situation in Syria's Idlib province, as well as, of course, just the Turkey-Russia relationship in the context not just of Syria, but in more general terms as well when it comes to S-400 and otherwise. But to continue the discussion, we're now joined by Kamran Gasanov, who is a political observer with Sargad TV. He is joining us now from Antalya in Turkey. And we're also joined by Andreea Stoian, who is an independent researcher who is originally based in Turkey, but currently she is in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we're also joined by Hadi Wahab, who is a doctoral researcher and postgraduate teacher assistant at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He's joining us now from Exeter itself. Hadi, Andreea, and Kamran, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Hadi, I'd like to start with you, and I wanted to ask you, do you think that countries that are so polar opposite when it comes to their interests in Idlib or Syria, such as Russia and Turkey, can they really actually work together to bring peace to the country and to Idlib more specifically?
Hi, Waqar. I think that that's not the main concern for Turkey and for Russia. They can do bilateral talks among them, but there's a broader picture here. So this month, the talks between the United States and Turkey have allowed Turkey to operate in east of the Euphrates, so the Kurds will have to withdraw between 5 and 14 kilometers, shaping, if we can say, a buffer zone on Turkish border, and then the bilateral talks between Russia and Turkey did not end somewhere like they didn't have a serious outcome 2 days ago, because I guess the offensive will keep on going, and the Syrian regime and the Russians, even yesterday, kept bombing Idlib. But I guess the main problem here is the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and the show, if we can name it like that, the show that Erdogan and Putin did in front of the Su-57 or 36, something like that, the aircraft. This was a message for the United States, I guess, and for the NATO, and furthering relationships between Russia and Turkey is concerning the United States. So they can bargain a deal, but the Turks will have to do something about the jihadists such as Hayat Tahrir Sham. If they don't do that, there's no solution that's looming. And for doing that, they will have to talk to us because there's no other solution.
Indeed. And on that last point, Andreea, do you think that Turkey is in fact going to speak to Assad directly, as I imagine Russia wants it to? And then secondly, do you also agree with Hadi that this is in fact about Turkey sending a message to the U.S.? Because there's a lot to discuss with the U.S. and agree upon with the U.S., isn't there? I mean, there's still some confusion, if I'm not mistaken, about the safe zone and how large it would be, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, definitely. Actually, I would like to start by making a comment regarding the buffer zone. The buffer zone is a subject that has been discussed for many years so far, and getting an agreement, it is definitely a victory for Turkey, who has been asking for a buffer zone for a long time. However, as you said, the details are not complete yet. Secondly, Hadi mentioned the A400. Actually, that's a very important subject because the second wave of the S400 technology just arrived in Turkey a few days ago. So that's a second stage in the Turkey-Russia partnership. They're getting closer and closer. Thirdly, when you were asking about the interest that President Erdogan would have in having a face-to-face discussion with Assad and Assad's regime, and whether he's ready to face directly, I don't think it's a priority for them. I think they're having a peaceful, a stabilization period in Turkey, in Syria now, for both Russia and Turkey is not a priority. Unfortunately, they have other interests that they're willing to follow, and it's like. The perfect thing that would reflect that is that video from the last visit when both Putin and Erdogan are eating ice cream. That video, that footage, it actually says a lot. And it says a lot about the relationship of subordination at the same time that exists between the two sides. So if you want to see how things are going to work out or how discussions are moving on, look at that video, and that one tells everything, basically.
Kamran, do you agree with that from the Russian view? Just give us the context from there, because I imagine for the Russians, what happens in Idlib is important because, again, the Russian narrative is that there are terrorists in Idlib and they need to be dealt with.
So for Russian side, it's very important to push Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists out from Idlib, and it's what the main issue and the main concern for Putin, what he wants to solve with Erdogan. But I think that Russian-Turkish relations is always more than Syria. So these joint projects, Turkish Stream, buying of S-400 and nuclear power stations, also trade relations.
Let me go to you, Hadi, for a moment. Because, Hadi, I wonder, in the middle of all of this, when we're talking about Syria, obviously, are the Syrian people. And I've wondered this on previous shows as well here in Scope, and I believe I may have asked you this, but Idlib has always been a huge question mark, hasn't it? Every time there was, every time areas were quote-unquote liberated, according to the Syrian government, across the country, terrorists or militants or rebels, however you want to term them, and their families were sent to Idlib. And now Idlib is the main issue, seemingly. How does one deal with that? And can Russia, Turkey, and even Iran, as the three main countries in the Astana process, can they actually resolve that situation of Idlib somehow?
Yeah, that's the most important thing, because the talks between Russia and Turkey cannot only resolve the problem. I've spoken about that before, and I've written about it. The United States is a key player, Iran is a key player, and if someone can understand the mentality of the Syrian regime, they're not like a puppet for anyone. So at the end, they will have to sit with them on the table. So if we can say that putting all the jihadists and the armed factions in Idlib, it created concern. So at the beginning, the Turkish government didn't have a problem with that, but now the refugee crisis is concerning them. And Turkey has broader problems. So the four things that are concerning Turkey right now are the refugee crisis. That's one thing. And the Kurds, which have been a long-term problem. And the relations with the U.S. that are souring. And you have the Sunni-Sunni confrontation over the Islamic world between them, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which, by the way, I guess might have and be having later on a role in Syria, because I guess they consider Syria a buffer zone against the Turkish expansion in the region. So they will have to find, and even 2 days ago when Putin and Erdogan met, Erdogan said that the Syrian regime has to stop bombing so we can implement the Sochi Accord. And I guess he didn't do his role to implement the Sochi Accord, so why now he wants the Syrian regime to stop? He had to do it for, and the Syrian concern is, as a first step, they want to take the M4 and M5 highways as a first step. Then after that we will see, and we've seen selfies for the Syrian army beside the Turkish checkpoints. So I guess Turkey is pressured, and they're not being able to operate right now because Russia are pressuring them to do that.
Okay, so Andreea, I wonder what your thoughts are there on what Hadi there said, because it is a bit confusing, isn't it, what Turkey wants to happen right now. Obviously, it is concerned about the security of the homeland, national security, and that's what it says is its biggest concern when it comes to Syria, vis-a-vis who it calls terrorist groups that are based in Syria. That's why it wants that buffer/safe zone, as it may call it. But then beyond that as well, when it comes to Idlib and others, what exactly are the Turkish interests?
Actually, the situation of Turkey is pretty difficult because they are kind of the crossroads, and they have, on one side, they have Russia, which in the past year has been their backup, their way of showing the U.S. that whenever U.S. is not being right or is not respecting its promises, Turkey has another option. It's actually something that they've learned. They show that they've learned their lessons of the past. On the other side, it's still the West, it's still the U.S. Which in the end accepts to have a buffer zone very late. Why now? That would be a very good question to ask. Why now? Why are we having now a buffer zone? This has been asked for many years so far. And then you have, in the middle, Turkey on its own and its own interests. The refugee crisis has been mentioned. Definitely, it is a problem. The refugees that are in Turkey right now officially is 3 million. It's actually more than 4 million. However, difficult the situation might be social-wise, political-wise, economic-wise when it comes to the refugees that are present in Turkey now. At the same time, there are very important cards that Turkey plays when it comes to the EU and its negotiations. It's very easy to threaten the EU with this card. And the same time is the problem of the Kurds that has been mentioned, and Syria is a hot point when it comes to the Kurdish situation. So it is very hard to understand Turkey right now because their position is very complex. It's such a mixture of relations and such a mixture of sides that they have to give, to face, that there's no really time and place left for their own interest. They're just, responding right now.
Okay, well, we'll leave that as a final word that gotten the best of us. But of course, we appreciate both Hadi and Andreea for speaking to us. Kamran was also speaking to us just for a few moments there earlier as well before he got cut off. And of course, for sharing their insight and taking their time out, of course, as well. It's a complex situation, as Andreea there said at the end, that Turkey finds itself in. Is it its own fault or not? That's obviously up for debate as well. but it certainly is worried about its national security, as it has said from day one, really, of this entire situation. It is no fan of the Assad government in Damascus either. Is it more leaning towards Russia? That seems pretty clear at the moment, but certainly it doesn't completely want to walk away from the F-35 program either, because it had a role to play in all of that. Yet it is buying the S-400, yet it is continuing to receive parts, as Andreea also said. Yet, on top of all this, as Hadi also mentioned, the issue of these militants/terrorists in Idlib, specifically Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, remnants, etc., that's also a huge issue beyond just the issue of PKK, who Turkey also calls terrorists. None of that can just remain unresolved forever. That needs to be dealt with by somebody, be it the Syrian government or members of the international community such as Russia, Turkey, or others, even the US possibly. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation, but certainly Turkey-Russia cooperation vis-a-vis Syria and otherwise remains an interesting subject to follow. I'll be back after a short break with the next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and we're going to discuss Israel and its elections. And I'm putting this in context with two specific stories, and this about the attacks that Israel has carried out in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq recently. Is Benjamin Netanyahu actually trying to provoke some sort of a reaction from Iran or even the Iraqis, Syrians, Lebanese? We can talk about Hezbollah or even the PMUs in Iraq. That would obviously, wouldn't it, help any election cause for Netanyahu? It would strengthen his hand going into the elections, because obviously no one would want to change a leader in the midst of a war if one were to break out, God forbid. Secondly, then, there's also the issue of the U.S. not releasing the political part of what it has called the deal of the century, as we know, between the Israelis and Palestinians to bring peace to the region. And the American officials have said they do not want to make this an election issue. And certainly, with the Israeli public right now, I imagine, and one would imagine, that Netanyahu giving any concessions to the Palestinians would be political suicide in some terms. Let's discuss both of those factors a bit further. We're now joined by Daniel Fridberg, who is a consultant to NGOs and projects, and he promotes dialogue and peace building in Israel-Palestine. He's joining us now from Dunedin in New Zealand. We're also joined by Gideon Levy, who is a journalist, and he is joining us now from Tel Aviv. Daniel and Gideon, thank you both for joining us. Daniel, I'd like to start with you. I wanted to ask you about these attacks that have been carried out by Israel. It has brought into the open now, really, hasn't it, what many people have called this shadow war that has been taking place for many years in the region. Does Netanyahu want to provoke the Iranians? Because many people say that if the other side doesn't respond, that it makes it look weak and gives the Israelis even more opportunity to then attack them again and again.
Well, I would say Netanyahu has been very skillful and experienced in walking on a very thin ice in the past decade or so, with these attacks pretty much going on continuously without much of a reaction or a significant reaction. So the new thing is really Netanyahu bringing it very publicly to the knowledge of the world, but it seems that his main audience, and I agree with your observation, is the Israeli public. And approaching the elections, he can really use every single vote he can collect, mostly from the parties that's on his right in the political map.
Gideon, give us your thoughts, sir, from Tel Aviv. Do you think is, as I said, really about the elections? And then if so, this is quite a dangerous game for Netanyahu to be playing, isn't it?
First of all, it's by all means not only about the elections. This policy goes on now for years. The publications might have to do with the elections, and nothing is more sure than this. The publications in this timing are directly connected to the elections and to some more international development, and this is the open option of American president meeting the Iranian regime. Netanyahu will do anything possible to sabotage this.
Why does Netanyahu fear that so much? A meeting between Rouhani and Trump. Why would Israel not want that to occur?
Because according to Netanyahu, it might end up exactly like the meeting with the leader of North Korea, with many smiles and no real results. For Netanyahu, it's almost an obsession, Iran. Exaggerated or not, he sees it as his main struggle. And for him, anything but a surrender of Iran, but a declaration that Iran gives up the nuclear project, anything less than this is not enough for Netanyahu. And any kind of dialogue between the United States and Iran might end up with some kind of compromise, which for Netanyahu, and I insist, it's really personal here, for Netanyahu, it is suicidal.
Daniel, do you agree with that? Do you think that ability may have just scared Netanyahu really when Trump spoke about the fact that there is a possibility for him to meet the Iranian leadership in the coming weeks?
Yes, I fully agree with Gideon. I think the thing that Netanyahu did in his last term, ever since President Trump was elected and came into office, was to put all the eggs really in one basket and gamble and bet on a very questionable American president, questionable not only in his decision-making processes, but also in where his interests lie. And being able to control Trump was something that Netanyahu was always very proud of, and he promoted this notion that he's really has the American president on a leash, so to speak, although he wouldn't use this term. But obviously, and like you say, Trump is very unexpected, and his interest might shift very rapidly according to developments. Now with this economical wars with China, he can use any ally, or at least lower the fires or the flames with other enemies. So it can be completely unexpected and go out of Netanyahu's reach. So this is a great gamble he's putting the entire region into, really.
Indeed, and on that point, Daniel, I wanted to stick with you because do you think that this may very well backfire? Because as I had said earlier as well, the Iranians, experts have said that for the Iranians, the PMUs in Iraq or even Hezbollah in Lebanon, for them not to respond at this time would show great weakness on their part, considering this has now come out publicly. This has been declared essentially publicly, and it's now public knowledge around the world that Israel carried out these attacks. So has he sort of bitten off more than he can chew and has already shown, if I may use this term, that Israel is the aggressor in this case?
He might have. Being an aggressor was never a big concern for Israel in the past decade or so. This rhetorics of us just defending ourselves has given place really to a discourse about our rights on the land, our rights to defend ourselves wherever we are, even if it means that we are aggressors. So this is not of a big concern for him. I think that the American response to when the attack on Iraq in July became public, one of the first American responses was that the Iraqis have the right to defend themselves. And this really speaks to the nightmare of Israel to be left alone in this arena. So Israel is very comfortable of taking the role of the unleashed monster that the Americans keep trying to being under control. But if the Americans are not there, there's nothing that will stop Israel. And Israel does need an excuse not to go too far. And in that sense, it might backfire. So Netanyahu needs to do everything he can to have Trump back on his side, to support him, and in a way to restrain him as well.
Gideon, I imagine, because, in the past, it seems like Israel's very obsessed also with its global image, isn't it? I might be wrong on that, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you think so, and if you agree with Daniel, because I imagine that Israel would not want to be seen as an aggressor in this case.
I couldn't agree more with Daniel. Israel changed in the last years, and Israel couldn't care less about its image. Israel under Netanyahu has only one goal, and this is power, to be strong. That's the philosophy of Netanyahu. He repeated it many times. He believes that only the strong one will survive in this jungle that we are living in, so-called. And most of the Israelis couldn't care less about morality, about human rights, about international image. They anyhow are taught to believe that the world is against us no matter what we do. There's no bigger lie than this. But that's what most of the Israelis believe, including Netanyahu. It doesn't matter. The world will always be anti-Semite. The world will always hate Israel. The world will always want to see Israel falling down. And therefore, no matter what we do, the image will remain the same image. And, until now, it worked for Netanyahu, because with this image of the bully, Israel as a bully, international relations of Israel are doing quite well, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, so Daniel, taking that point then, I want to then talk about the second portion of the topic, and that about the U.S. choosing not to release the political portion of its peace plan for then. This has been greatly delayed anyways, the peace plan, of course, between the Israelis and Palestinians. Do you think, in a case where the Israeli public would not want to see its leader giving concessions to the Palestinians, that's what at least has been understood from why the Americans would not want to release the political portion, that in such a case, then can this peace plan actually ever even work? However strong Netanyahu may come out with a mandate in these elections or not, at the end of the day, some concessions will be given, won't they?
Presumably, yes. Throughout the years, Israel's strategy was to accept the concessions, assuming that the Palestinian side will refuse, and again, will lose face in the public, in the world public view. What's happening now is that, first of all, we saw how much impact, practically zero, the economical part of Trump's initiative had so far. We know that Trump did everything he could to make sure that there will be no partner, there will be no counterpart on the Palestinian side to even respond in any way to the political, so to speak, political side of his initiative. No one really knows what it means, what it has. No one knows what experts provided advice to develop this. And in short, most people doubt if there even is such a thing as the political initiative. And if there is, how serious it is or how relevant it is anymore.
That's an interesting point, Gideon. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Is it about the Israeli public not, do you think, really being open to having their leader giving any concessions? Or is this just about the fact that there may not even be much of a political portion to this deal, as Daniel said?
First of all, Waqar, you have to understand, and your viewers have to understand, that the Palestinian issue is totally off the table in the Israeli discourse. The occupation, the really most major fatal questions are not discussed, are not on the table. Peace became almost an illegal word in Israeli vocabulary. And nobody talks about those things. It's not like it's around the table, around the corner, and it's all about if the Israelis will agree or not agree. It's not on the table, it's off the table. And the deal of the century is not being taken seriously until now, and rightly so. If this will come out as something that the Americans will really put all the pressure. But why would the current president, Donald Trump, put his pressure on Israel when no American president ever pushed Israel to make any concessions? So Donald Trump will be the one? I doubt it very much.
Okay, man, that's a good point to end on, I think. Of course, I'd like to thank Gideon and Daniel for their time and, of course, for their expert insight on these issues. viewers, we've spoken about two aspects of things that are related to the Israeli elections. Firstly, of course, the Israeli attacks in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. There will be a response of some sort, as Hezbollah has said, as the PMUs have said, as even the Syrian government, i.e. Bashar al-Assad's government specifically, has said as well. And of course, the Iranians have also said that they will respond in some way because their interests, or what may be called their proxies, have been the ones who have been attacked in these three countries. What does that mean? Does Netanyahu want war? Would it be a bad thing for him to be seen as an aggressor? As our guest said, they may not care. He may not care at this point if he is even seen as an aggressor. And then, of course, about the peace plan, the quote-unquote peace plan, the deal of the century as well, as Jared Kushner calls it and others. Is that all just really rhetoric? Does no one really believe that? And it seems that no one really believes that. The economic side of it didn't really go very well. We'll keep a close eye on how that develops in the region, because certainly that is an explosive situation that could get a lot worse in the coming days and weeks and months here in the Middle East. We'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.